So now I'm going to turn it over to John here for a second so that he can go over his graphic.
Hello, thank you very much for coming. My name is Jonathan Stein. You saw the graphic that was you saw the graphic that was handed out earlier, and we had that graphic is going to be called the 3 graphic, and then we had the 1 graphic that we're going to start with up top to just guide through. What David and I are going to do is we're going to go through the 6 items on the handout to just explain what it is. We are at a once-in-a-generation opportunity to make real change at the airport, not real change to modify the status quo, but to totally disrupt it. We're talking about the kind of change that will shrink the airport, that will get rid of the jets, that will get rid of the pattern flying. Now, there's every reason to believe, and you'll hear that explained here, but there's every reason to believe we'll succeed. But we'll succeed with a big if. We'll succeed if we can overcome some of the worst aspects of government. I mean, quite frankly, the staff in the City Hall is extremely good at their job. They're very good, they're very well paid, fabulous retirements, and they are actually better at their job than the City Council. And it's unfortunate because the staff is very much committed to either the status quo or, in response to movement on the council, to something very close to the status quo. They don't want to see the disruptive change that we're talking about. They don't want to see 2,000 feet of runway go away so that a jet cannot land there, because it's not lawful for a jet to land on only 3,000 feet of runway. It needs all 5,000 feet. They don't want to see all the leases go away, because those leases are the tenants, those are outside the city interests that are historically in Santa Monica outside of the city interests, not other neighborhoods like yourself, medical interests, airport interests, development interests, the influence of extremely rich people that live in Santa Monica or up in Malibu. These interests have overborne the ability of the neighborhoods and the residents to convince city staff to act on their behalf. That's just a fact of life. And what we're trying to do is change that fact. We have 2 new people on the City Council that we think are committed to the concerns of residents. You share those concerns. And we have people on the Airport Commission like David that share the concerns. If only we had 7 folks like Bill Rosendahl. He's frank, and he stands for the best in government, and what we have to do, thank goodness for the best parts of government, empower people like us. What we have to do is persevere, be organized, be tenacious, and not accept second-rate decision-making. So what is it that we want? We have 6 items on the handout. It's right up there. A says allow the 1984 FAA agreement to expire on July 1, 2015. No negotiation, no extension, no exceptions. Well, what does that mean? David, first of all, what is the 1984 FAA agreement?
Okay. In the early 80s, there were a number of lawsuits, and ultimately they resulted in the 1984 agreement, which was a settlement agreement. And looking back historically, it's easy to Monday morning quarterback and think about how you would negotiate with the FAA if they were asking for the provisions of the agreement. But the agreement has 4 key provisions. One is that the City of Santa Monica has to operate the airport as an airport until July 1st, 2015. The second key provision, which is provision 9, says that they must maintain a 5,000-foot runway. The third key provision, which is section 13, says that they must have airport tie-downs and fuel sales. And section 14 says that they must rent space to aviation tenants. So if I'm sitting on the other side of the table from the FAA and saying, okay, you want to negotiate that you get to keep 5,000 feet of runway, that means I don't have to have 5,000 feet of runway? Or I have to rent space to aviation tenants, you mean I don't have to rent space to aviation tenants? Or I have to sell fuel, you mean I really don't have to sell fuel? Clearly we did. These were all tasks or actions that other airport proprietors had used to reduce operations at airports.
Right. So what the 1984 agreement is it addressed the classic division of power between two arms of government. This is stuff that's very easy to understand. The city is the proprietor of the airport, like the proprietor of a store. It owns the land, it runs the airport, it has jurisdiction and authority of the airport. If somebody runs into the airport and steals the wallet off a desk, it would be the city of Santa Monica that had the authority to arrest them. However, the FAA has regulatory authority. It runs a national network of airports. It runs the really big stuff, but also runs little stuff like small rural airports in Arkansas. You know what Arkansas is? It's a bunch of pig farms. It is the most productive area of pork, feeding the entire world. Feeding 7 billion people eat pork from Arkansas and Missouri. And they need their airports. We have the same people running ours. So you have regulatory powers, you had proprietor powers, and there was an agreement that said how they're going to operate together.
Okay, but not to confuse the issue. Let's stay focused on what the rights are in single. It's very simple. It's like if you look at the 3 agreements in ANCA, it's very confusing. And when I first came on the Airport Commission, every time I proposed some sort of reduction, they said that's a flight access limitation and it's prohibited under ANCA. So after I got that 5 or 6 times, I guess I said, well, I better read ANCA and see what it says. So I read ANCA, and ANCA says that the penalties for violation of ANCA are no more airport funds, and you can't charge passenger fees. So I said, well, we don't take any airport funds. The city has decided not to do that, so it wouldn't be constrained by the federal government. And we don't charge passenger fees, so do we have to comply with ANCA? Well, then the response came back, well, actually, no, we don't have to comply with ANCA. So now ANCA's off the table. So now we have 3 agreements left. We have the 1948 Instrument of Transfer. We have the 1984 Santa Monica Airport Agreement, which expires on July 1st, 2015. And we have the 1994 Grant Assurances. So the 1948 Instrument of Transfer says we must operate a portion of the airport as an airport in perpetuity.
Now, let's just talk about for a second. You see right up there? There is a part in black, that's up in the northern part and the eastern part. Then there's a part below that in red, that's not under the instrument of transfer. And then there's a part to the west, which we have turned into a park to show just how easy it would be to do that. And that is also not under the 1984 instrument of transfer. So
this portion right here is the part that's under the 1940 instrument of transfer. It says this portion must be operated as an airport in perpetuity. This portion down here is not. It was quitclaimed to the city in 1949, and it's not encumbered by that. And this was sort of the Missouri purchase here. This was taken out of airport use in 1984 by the 1984 agreement. In consideration for allowing this 5,000-foot runway to operate, they took this out of airport use. So the 2 pieces that are in play are this one and this one.
right. And so, David, when you say that the 1984 agreement expires, what does that free the city to do?
Okay, when the 84 agreement expires, the 3 key things the FAA had bargained for were the 5,000-foot runway, fuel cells, and renting space to aviation tenants. Those 3 rights clearly expire with that agreement. And they're not contained in any other agreement that the FAA has with the city of Santa Monica or any other federal law that we're bound by.
So does that mean that the city of Santa Monica could take out 2,000 feet of runway on July 2nd of 2015?
Yes.
Does that mean... Does that mean that the city of Santa Monica could stop selling any aircraft fuel at all on July 2nd of 2015?
Yes, with the caveat. Our continuing agreements say that we must not discriminate against any class of aircraft. And that's what the FAA demanded, so we have to ensure that we sell no fuel. We can't just stop selling jet fuel or propeller fuel. We have to stop selling all fuel.
And if the city of Santa Monica exercised proprietorship powers that are clearly acknowledged by the FAA, that are clearly present in 30 years of case law from cases from every corner of the country, if it exercised those powers that are clearly acknowledged by all the parties, what would the airport look like on July 2nd of 2015?
The the easterly parcel, which is about 3,000 feet of runway, would be a general aviation Class B airport, which is what our airport really was designed for. It was designed for small planes. It was never designed for Class C and D jets.
Okay. Now, David.
The FAA requires, the FAA guidelines require runway safety areas at each end of the runway. The City of Santa Monica currently is not allowed to put those in because our 1984 agreement says we must maintain 5,000 feet of runway. And so if we took 1,000 feet at each end for the required runway safety area for jets, there wouldn't be enough room for jets to land. So the FAA has said, we're going to ignore our own guidelines and allow people to take off or planes to take off without these runway safety areas. In 2015, because it's a smaller runway, the guidelines for a smaller runway are 300-foot runway safety areas in each end. So if you have a 3,000-foot runway and you take 300 feet off of this end and you take 300 feet off of this end, then we end up with a 2,400-foot general aviation aircraft runway.
Okay. Now, let me just clarify one thing, though. Even without the reconfiguration and even without the safety standards, if the airport shrinks from 5,000 feet to 3,000 feet, are there any jets currently designed that can lawfully land on 3,000 feet?
Yes, the smallest Class A jets can.
Okay, so you're talking about a very small percentage.
Very small.
Okay, now, we're going to turn to B. Why don't you stay up there, David? Allow all aviation leases at airport to expire according to their terms on July 1, 2015. Now, we're talking about aviation leases. Is this landlord-tenant?
Yes, it is.
What are the aviation leases?
The city, as proprietor of the airport, has the right to dictate what the terms and conditions of the tenancies are at the airport, and that's actually even contained in the 1984 agreement.
And so the tenants, now the tenants are, we're talking about the people that have hangars, the people that rent out tie-downs so you can put your aircraft there, the people that are mechanics on jets, the people that sell air fuel, they're all tenants on an aviation lease.
That is correct. Now,
are all these leases, are all of them synchronized to expire on July 1st of 2015?
Yes, they are. Again, on that issue, one more caveat. Our continuing agreement, the 1948 Instrument of Transfer, says that we can't discriminate against any class of aircraft. So if we're going to get rid of all aviation tenants, if we're going to get rid of aviation tenants, we have to get rid of all aviation tenants. We can't say flight schools have to go and somebody else can stay. And really a better way to approach it is that we want to say that there are industrial uses that are incompatible with neighboring land uses, because then it becomes a land use issue. I mean, when you don't put a toxic factory next to a residential neighborhood, you separate industrial neighborhoods or industrial areas from residential areas. Well, this is essentially an industrial use, and it's got a very toxic and polluting use. So we need to make it a very light industrial use, and any tenant who has a use that creates pollution, that injures the neighboring land uses, should be disallowed.
So in looking at this once the agreement expires, if the Santa Monica City Council does not act to extend it, or does not act to put a new agreement in place that is some modification of that, if it actually ends, and then is Santa Monica within its rights as the proprietor of the airport to simply say to its tenants, we, the City of Santa Monica, are your landlord, your lease is up, and you must leave?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, item C says on July 2nd, 2015, okay, the next day after the 1984 agreement expires, the next day after the aviation leases expire, on July 2nd, 2015, render 2,000 feet of runway unusable. Agree to pay any FAA fine necessary to do so, estimated at $30,000. What does that mean?
Okay, that's not quite correct. So let me clarify that. There is continuing right now there's a grant assurance in place. It was put in place in 1994 and it was supposed to last 20 years. It's supposed to expire in 2014. However, the city of Santa Monica took an additional grant on that grant in 2003, so the FAA is maintaining the position that that grant expires in 2023, 7 years later. Now, I'm not here to give my legal opinion. I've looked at that, and I can't say, I mean, it's a 50-50 coin toss. I think a judge could look at it either way.
But
so I'm going to assume that that grant assurance is going to stay in place.
Okay, well, Bill David, let's talk again.
Let me finish, though.
Very good.
So assuming that grant assurance stays in place, then we have to, the penalty for violating it is paying back the funds that you took, and the additional grant that the city took was $250,000, so they'd have to pay that back. Now, the fine that John put down on this for $30,000 or $33,000 was a penalty to close a chartered instrument approach airport. And the city of Chicago closed an airport in 2003, and they did it overnight, and they didn't give any warning. They just took bulldozers out and dozed the runway.
Oh, by the way, David, before you continue, is it really that easy to render a runway unusable that you could?
Yes. So
Hey, Bill, you're going to be around to sit on a bulldozer to render that runway unusable, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Okay, so what the city of Chicago did, they had a grant assurance in place that was identical to ours. And they just closed the airport. They paid back the grant assurance money. And what was funny about it was the mayor asked for the grant assurance so he'd have funds to tear up the airport. He actually used the funds to destroy the airport. So the FAA made him pay back those funds, and they charged him the $33,000, which was an $1,100 a day fine. The FAA was so angry that they couldn't do anything about that they could only charge him $33,000, that they have subsequently increased the fine from $1,100 a day to $10,000 a day. So now if you close an airport like that without notice, it would be a $300,000 payment. However, the city of Santa Monica has the right to get the notice that it's going to remove the 2,000 feet of runway, and it wouldn't incur any fine. You just have to pay back the grant assurance.
Now let's talk a little bit, let's put something in perspective. $250,000 sounds like a lot of money to me, but what is the annual budget of the city of Santa Monica?
I don't know.
It's about $500 million. So we can afford to pay a $250,000 payment.
The litigation would easily be more than that.
Beginning to the next one, it says the City Council D, the City Council should adopt the 5 existing Airport Commission resolutions, some effective now and some effective July 2nd, 2015. What are the Santa Monica Airport Commission resolutions?
Okay, John, we need to respect the timekeeper here. So let's take another minute and finish this up. You know, the Santa Monica Airport Commission made 3 sets of recommendations to the City Council, and those recommendations, I believe, are available on the CASMAT site. So if anybody wants to see them, in the sake of preserving time here, I would refer you to the CASMAT site to look at those.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
So the next person is Bill.
So fine, yeah. Well, what you just heard is meat and potatoes for potential legal action on our part. You hear lawyers clearly pointing out what our options are. To have the chair of a Santa Monica committee be as blunt and as clear and as honest as he was is extraordinary. It puts that whole airport in jeopardy and acknowledges the fact that the expiration of certain pieces of this will be real. It will change the dynamic. Worst case, we shut the whole thing down, which is where I'm at. or we at least get rid of the jets and this, that, and the other, you know, the training schools and all. I want the whole airport shut, and I want to explain how we do it in a second. But before I do, I want us to realize this. The FAA are the pit bulls to the policymakers who are the members of the House of Representatives. The Senate has some role, but just like in the council, it's the local, okay? The local council member in the city of LA calls the shots. The local member of the House of Representatives is responsible for the relationship with the FAA during that period. The FAA is a pit bull for the Washington policymakers. We are right now, and Carmen Tutanich is at the door, which is extraordinarily great that our city attorney is here. Give him a round of applause. Our extraordinary opportunity is there are 5 members of the House of Representatives that are impacted or are care about or are part of this region that can dramatically impact it. We put a lot of pressure on Henry Waxman, and I might say Henry and I have been working together recently on incredible progress at the VA property. We were digging with the shovels, Henry and Zev and I. You know, I got to work with everybody. Even when I have problems with people, if we can find ways to have a new beginning, a new start, a more positive attitude, that's what I'm all about. And it was great to be there with Henry on one side and Zev on the other and start breaking ground for more homeless housing there. So there is a sensitivity and a concern. But the 5 members are the following. Know this. Write them down. Julia Brownlee used to be in Santa Monica. I love her. I supported her early. She's a member of the House of Representatives, isn't she? Is she a member of the House? Yes. She's a Santa Monicite, even though, but very powerful, okay? Maxine Waters, big time. Janice Hahn, my sister, big time. Henry Waxman, the true leader in this area. With them engaged, we can do anything with this airport. And I just want you to realize the 5 members of the House of Representatives that have a history or relationship to regionalism or to this airport, they can change that dynamic. You will then find the senators will go along. And of course, the president will go along because the members of the House are the policymakers. Remember that and hold it tight. Keep it close to you. Okay, Howard Fine. I want Howard to come up to the mic and I'll give we did it wrong. Dr. Fine, come on up. Dr. Philip Fine. Okay, we got a huge interaction with him when Ted Lieu put this guy into a major moment to share with us a lot of different things that he's been doing. Phil has given us more of a respect for the seriousness and the health hazards on every level. As a scientist, forget politics, and that's key. Dr. Fine, tell us about what you did, what you've been doing for the years you've been doing it, where you think we are now, and where you think we should be going. Dr. Fine.
Thank you, Councilman. I've been at AQMD, South Coast AQMD, for about 7 years, and this is one of the first things I was assigned when I started there. And there's been an incredible amount of progress made that I've seen by the community, by the elected officials, and I've learned more today than I've learned in those entire several years about some of the legal issues and opportunities you have in the future. What I'm going to talk about today is a little anticlimactic because you're all talking about the future, but I'm going to be talking a little bit in the past about some of the studies that AQMD has done around the airport, in addition to some of the studies other people have done around the airport. And many of you have seen this before. I've been to this community many, many times, presented the results of these studies. Maybe some of you haven't. What I'd really like to do is be here to answer questions, either maybe after everyone else speaks, about the health impacts and the pollution impacts of the airport. Next slide. For those of you that don't know, the South Coast Air Quality Management District is the local air quality agency for a large 4-county area, the greater Los Angeles area, including these 4 counties. We have about 17 million people in our jurisdiction. That's about 1 out of every 19 people in the entire United States we're responsible for providing clean and breathable air to. We have 10,000 square miles. We have over millions of vehicles, hundreds of thousands of trucks, and we have the port complex, which is our nation's largest gateway. About 40% of the cargo comes in through our ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles, and this is one of our bigger air quality challenges. Next slide, please. When we talk about pollution, we talk about kind of two types of pollution. And the first type is regional pollution. And this is a pollution that comes from the sum total of all the cars and trucks and airports and industrial facilities and power plants. This all goes into the air, and it gets blown towards the east in most days, and it cooks in the air over hours or even days. And this is where we get the poor air pollution inland in like Riverside and San Bernardino. We're very lucky here on the west side, other than Topanga Canyon. This type of air pollution is generally very good in this area. We're close to the ocean, prevailing breeze takes it away from us. Our emissions do affect those people who live inland, and we need to reduce them, but we aren't exposed to this type of pollution. This is generally ozone pollution as well as PM 2.5, particulate matter, very small particles in there, less than a certain size, 2.5 microns. Next slide. The other type of pollution we deal with is local pollution and the impacts of facilities on people who live locally. And this is what we deal with in situations like a single industrial facility or a busy roadway or an airport like Santa Monica or even LAX. And these types of pollutants, the closer you are to the source, the higher the pollution is. They dissipate relatively rapidly. There's been studies done on roadways and at Santa Monica Airport that most of the impacts occur within that first 300, 400, 500 meters. After that, the pollution diffuses a little bit and concentrations are much lower. So this is the kind of pollution that is relevant to the Santa Monica Airport issue. Next slide. That type of pollution includes things like air toxics as well as ultrafine particles and diesel emissions, diesel particulate that come mostly from diesel trucks. And when you look across the basin, the largest cancer risk from these types of air toxics comes from diesel exhaust. About 80% of our extra cancer risk across the basin comes from diesel. There are some similarities between the particles that come from, say, jet exhaust and diesel engines. There haven't been enough studies to show that they're exactly the same, but there are some similar chemicals in both those types of particles that come out. Next slide. So as an overview to our project, back in about 2006, or before that, 2005, we received a grant from the US EPA to study general aviation airports and the emissions from general aviation airports. We selected two airports, Van Nuys and Santa Monica. We chose Van Nuys because at the time it was the largest general aviation airport in the country. And we chose Santa Monica, next slide, because of the unique situations in Santa Monica. First of all, the rapid increase in jet traffic that was occurring at the time, which you've heard about, as well as the lack of any buffer zone and the proximity of the residents to right where the planes take off at the beginning of the runway and also at the other side. So we chose these two airports and we went out and did some sampling for 2 different seasons, summer season and winter season, and we do that to capture the different meteorological conditions. Next slide. This is where we set up around Santa Monica. This is Santa Monica Airport. You can see we kind of located our monitors along the flight path there. We also located monitors right where the takeoff area is, numbers 2 and 3. Number 2 is actually on airport property right next to the blast fence. Number 3 is in a residence, the Ernst residence. You've heard about Virginia here today. It was right in her backyard, and we monitored for a variety of pollutants in that area as well. You can see here that the winds generally blow along the direction of the runway. That's why the direction of the runway faces that way. And the prevailing wind is from west to east towards that neighborhood on the east there. One thing I want to mention is we monitored for lead. We monitored for a lot of different air toxics, but this particular study was designed to look at the long-term health effects, long-term exposure, which generally is perhaps some increased risk in cancer. It was not designed to look at short-term impacts, but we did find some short-term impacts, and that's why we came back later, and I'll talk about that. Next slide. This is a close-up of that runway site, which we call the East Tarmac site. And then further east there is the residence, and you can see that the residential neighborhood is really very, very close, within 250, 300 feet of where the jets take off. This is a very unique situation. I don't know of any other airport in the country that has such proximity to where jets are actually operating and taking off. Next slide. Again, I mentioned a wide range of measurements. We included ultrafine particles, we included lead, and again, most of the measurements we take over the course of the entire day and averages, so it's generally designed to look at long-term exposure. Next slide. I'm going fast here because I want to try to get us back on schedule. The findings from that study, the report's available online, many of you have seen it. was that the lead levels in the communities and near the runways were below these new tighter federal standards that came in line about 2008 or so, but they were elevated. We did find higher lead right east of the runway, as well as in the residential community, not above the federal standards, but definitely elevated, and I'll show some pictures of that. But the airport influence on some of these other pollutants that we're talking about, carbon monoxide, particulate matter, volatile organic compounds, organic gases, on a long-term basis, we didn't find too much, okay? And this is, again, on a long-term basis, not necessarily on a short-term 1 minute or 2 minute basis. The other thing we found, in addition to the lead, was the ultrafine particles were highly elevated on a short-term basis east of the airport. And this has been found by the other study Suzanne Paulson did at UCLA as well. So the two main findings from the study, lead from the general aviation aircraft was elevated, and from jet aircraft, the ultrafine particles were extremely elevated. Next slide. This just shows some of the findings, and you can see how high the lead levels were east of the airport. We're on airport property, we're at about 85 nanograms per cubic meter. I can explain that later. The federal standard was 150. This is averaged over 3 months, but again, elevated because background levels are much lower, in the range of maybe 3 to 10 nanograms per cubic meter. We didn't find elevated lead levels west of the airport. You can see we had a site in Marine Park, at Wall Grove Elementary, and even right west of the runway. And at those areas, we didn't find elevated lead. But east of the airport, it was definitely elevated. Next slide. And again, on the ultrafine particles, we did find, when jets were taking off, we did find those levels of ultrafine particles going up by factors of 100, sometimes 1,000 for a very short period of time. Now, ultrafine particles are not currently regulated by any government agency. There's no state level set. There's no, and research has been done to show that they can be harmful, but it's not at the point yet where we know what is safe, what isn't safe, and which types of ultrafine particles may be responsible for the observed health effects. So that's still a point of ongoing science. But we measured it because we know it's going to come into play in the next few years, and we do know that jet aircraft are one of the best generators of ultrafine particles that we know, much more than even a diesel truck or a passenger vehicle. Next slide. We also showed that as these jets were taking off, it wasn't just elevated at the runway location; it was also elevated in the residents in that nearby community. Maybe half as high, in some cases 80% as high. But that plume of ultrafine particles was making its way to the residential community, and we found it to be localized. Some of the UCLA studies showed it might even went out as far as a half a mile. We didn't measure that far out for ultrafine. Next slide. I'll go through these quickly. These are just showing some of the relative amounts of the other types of pollutants we measured for, like PM 2.5. As you can see here, this is what I was talking about. We didn't see elevated levels of these types of pollutants. And we didn't necessarily expect to, because these types of pollutants aren't necessarily emitted from jet aircraft or even general aviation aircraft. Next slide. This shows volatile organic compounds. These are the organic gases that you may smell, but again, we didn't find anything elevated on a long-term basis. Next slide. We did see on a short-term basis, we could take some instantaneous samples and measure those, and when we did that, we did find evidence of elevated compounds that could be toxic, that are very consistent with what we know about jet exhaust. So the jet exhaust was making its way into the community on a very short-term basis. But on these chemicals that may be toxic, we only had data for their long-term effects. They were nowhere near their short-term effects. But again, on a short-term basis, they were elevated. Next slide. So because of this, we came back for a follow-up study for several reasons. We wanted to explore further those short-term impacts. So the second study looked at short-term impacts versus long-term impacts. We looked at ultrafine. We also looked at black carbon because we have instruments that can measure those every minute. We also had this opportunity, as was mentioned earlier, the airport shut down for a little over a week to do some runway repairs. So we could measure before, during, and after and see what the changes are between before, during, and after. And then that makes it very easy to attribute it to airport activities. Next slide. So we just went back to that same eastern location at the tarmac, and then we actually went to the same place in Virginia's backyard, but we also put something inside her house to see if any of this pollution was making its way indoors. What we found indoors was her house is pretty enclosed. A lot of it didn't make it indoors. So what I'm going to show here is most of what we found out in the backyard. If had left the windows open, a lot of this stuff obviously would have made its way indoors. Next slide. So again, we found the same thing on the left there, that when the jet aircraft were taking off, very high elevated levels on a short-term basis, 1 minute or 5 minute basis, of ultrafine particles and something called black carbon, which is one of those chemicals in jet exhaust that is common to diesel exhaust. Again, we don't know how to exactly draw that connection, but there are common chemicals, and black carbon is what we use as a marker for diesel exhaust, and we're also finding it now in jet aircraft. On the right there, you see the period of the runway closure. So you can see all these spikes. You can see every day, you can see the daily patterns, but those spikes within each day are jets taking off, and when the runway was closed, you basically see nothing. Little peaks, maybe due to traffic on the roadway, but then as soon as the airport came back online, you see those peaks resume again. So this is obviously evidence that the airport was responsible for those types of observations. Next slide. We also did some work tracking the aircraft and seeing what type of aircraft were contributing to the high black carbon and ultrafine particles, as well as what type of activities. So this shows that basically by weight class, the larger the aircraft, the Class C aircraft cause higher peaks of ultrafine and black carbon than the Class B or Class A aircraft. The larger the aircraft, the larger the engine, the more emissions. That's kind of obvious, but we have data now to really show that that's true. Next slide. We also looked at different activities of the aircraft by type. So this was interesting because you'd assume that takeoff had the highest emissions, and this wasn't necessarily true. It's the taxiing and the run-up. The whole time, that first 2 minutes before they take off, we actually in many cases saw higher emissions than when they were actually taking off. And this is because the combustion conditions of the engines at that time are not as efficient. When they're taking off, they're at full throttle. The engines are running in very efficient mode. When they're running up, when they're holding, they're at 50%, 30%, and at that time it's not as efficient. You can actually get more emissions at that point. So this is the kind of information we were looking for because we wanted, and this is all in a final report too on our website, many of you have seen it. We wanted to be able to at least come up with some potential recommendations of how these kind of emissions can be mitigated. Next slide. So again, we don't have, these are just some ideas, engineering guesses that might have led to mitigating some of these issues that we saw. One thing was increasing the width of the blast fence. Right now the blast fence just covers the runway, not the taxiway. There was an idea that if you extended it further, you can solve some of the noise issues, but also divert some of the pollution coming off from the taxiway, the line of the taxiway as well. Reducing holding times obviously would reduce emissions, and we've all heard about that. If there's some way to redirect the exhaust of the taxiing and not have it go right towards the neighborhood, have it go off to the side or something, or have the planes orient in different manner when they are running up their engines or testing their engines, that would also help. And obviously, because we found that the larger aircraft are emitting more, if there was some way to limit the larger aircraft and get back to the smaller aircraft as the airport was originally designed for, that would obviously lower emissions as well. I think that's my last slide. Is that correct? Yes. So, like I said, a lot of you have seen this. Mostly here to answer questions. I don't want to interrupt the program. I'll hang around, and maybe if there's time for Q&A at the end, I hope we can answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Dr. Fine has been one of the major players in this. Laura wants to say a few words.
Due to our time constraints, what we're going to do is we're going to have our politicians come up, but I just want to say that we have more information about scientific data related to the airport, and we will put that online. Dr. Freunds from UCLA has very important things to say about the actual effects of ultrafine particles on the body, which I think people will be interested in. And then Sarah Dennison has put together information about the actual deleterious effects on children's learning and on their brain development and things of that sort related to noise. So we will put those. Everybody who signed in will get a link to that information. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura. Just a little housekeeping on it. Channel 35, which camera is mine? Okay. Oh, What we're doing, folks out there in the listening and viewing audience, is giving you an insight into the West Side, into a very serious issue that has to do with regionalism. We're all connected in this region, and I want to thank you, the Channel 35 viewer, for sharing your time with us. Stay with us. We have a very exciting next phase where the local politicians who really have something to say about this will have a chance to interact with each other. And also for Channel 35, you know that election on March 21st, on May 21st, we'll have some of these candidates for office. So get ready to vote on May 21st for mayor, for city attorney, for controller, and if there's a council seat open, that you do your homework and work on it from that level. But thank you, 35, the system, and the viewers for that. And I want to thank ABC. Let's give ABC a round of applause. You know, when ABC comes, it means that they're going to take it and run it a lot and put the issue out there. And we all know that the media presence is a key part of an element. Every politician will tell you. When those cameras come on, we learn how to smile and we learn how to talk through that lens to the people on the other side. Sometimes it's a little tough when they only give you 8 seconds of what you said. But most of the times, which is just fun for me, when I'm running around in this job as a council member, people will come running up to me and say, "Oh, Bill, I just saw you on TV." And I'll say, "Oh, you did? You did? Yeah. What was I talking about?" "Oh, I don't know, but you were great." Because as Henry Waxman is smiling there knows that when they give you 8 seconds, you hope it's the best 8 seconds and that you have a smile on so everybody can be positive. Henry, it's great to see you. You're going to be coming up and speaking in a minute or two, and I'm really proud of how we're connecting over at the VA property right now and making great progress. And before you walked in, I had mentioned that Karen Bass, Janice Hahn, Maxine Waters, and also Julia Brown can be part of your support system, Julia, all of them in dealing with the FAA and dealing with that issue. But at this point, I'm not going to talk politics, and I'm not playing politics right now. I'm going to enjoy listening to the present and future politicians who are running for office. And to do that, I'm going to introduce Betsy Butler. And let me say this about Betsy. Come on up, Betsy. Betsy's great. Just give her a round of applause as she's walking over. You know, in politics, you have to work with everybody. You have to deal with everything. You have to try to make it work. Well, when Betsy and I were both elected, we both were dealing with a critical issue, which was the Sepulveda Tunnel. I mean, it's a disaster. Filthy. Disgusting for years and years and years. So Betsy's the state, I'm the local. And we said, hey, why don't we pull all the bureaucrats together into a room? And Betsy and I put a dozen of them in the room, and we had them all pointing at themselves rather than at each other. And out of that came a memorandum of understanding. And now, go through the Sepulveda Tunnel and see the leadership that our state assembly member did. Betsy Butler, thank you for that. Now she's running for election in the 62nd district. I'm staying out of it at the moment. I want to see how the dynamics play, but I'm very, very impressed with a former assemblywoman that's done a great job up there. And let me give you a little background. Prior to being elected to the state assembly in 2010, Betsy served in the Clinton administration and the Environmental Defense Fund and the Consumer Attorneys of California. A resident of Marina del Rey area for 2.5 decades, she's a local, serves on the board of the Planned Parenthood in Los Angeles, the Redondo Beach Veterans Memorial, the Task Force, the Equity California. She currently serves as the interim executive director for the California Women's Law Center and is a candidate for the 62nd Assembly District. Betsy.
It's so good to see you, Bill. I don't see you enough, so thank you for being here. I want to bring Mike here and Mr. Kenneth up. Sure, and I'm going to do real brief introductions and questions. We're going to ask questions, and then each of you are going to answer, and if there's time, we're going to ask audience questions as well. So we'll see how this all plays out. Really quickly want to give a brief introduction. Mr. Chutanich was raised in San Pedro, is an undergraduate of USC, and received an MBA from USC as well. He received his law degree from South Bay University College of Law. He is a founding partner of Chutanich and Michael and was elected to the Office of City Attorney in 2009. He is seeking re-election. Mr. Fior Mr. Fuhrer was born and raised in San Bernardino, California. He received his undergraduate as well as his law degree from Harvard University. He served as a member of the Los Angeles City Council, District 5, and as a member of the California State Assembly, where he was chair of the Judiciary Committee. He is a candidate for the office of City Attorney. Thank you for being here. The City of Santa Monica has stated that if it were to seriously pursue the closure or severe curtailment options for Santa Monica Airport, the FAA would sue them, resulting in costly litigation with the FAA with uncertain results. Most residents on both sides of the city border feel that the City of Santa Monica should devote considerable resources for this fight if necessary until a final judgment is reached that cannot be appealed. Question to both of you to answer. Do you agree? What role do you think the City Attorney's Office can play in assisting the City of Santa Monica in this litigation?
So it's really important. Is it on now? What if I just talk? Can you hear me? Oh, good. I'll take Bill's mic. This is. It's not on. Hold it. Now it's on. This is the first time any of you seen Bill give a mic to somebody else.
That one works.
You know what?
It's on.
So,
Yeah.
no, not really. So,
Yeah, that's what's.
so look, here we have a very complicated legal landscape. Let's talk about it a little bit. But I'm talking about it through the lens of someone who has been focused on issues related to this airport for years. When I was on the City Council, as many of you know, I introduced a motion which passed the City Council to call on the City of Los Angeles to urge the City of Santa Monica to allow a Los Angeles resident to have a non-voting seat on the Airport Commission in Santa Monica. Why did I do that? Because we know that the impacts of the airport go far beyond the City of Santa Monica, and the City of Los Angeles should have a seat at that table. So now, let's get down to the issue of the litigation. Sure, the FAA has taken the position that since the early days of this, remember the 1948 fee agreement and the 1984 agreement and so on, that this needs to be used for airport purposes. I get it. But I think the City of Santa Monica, city attorney, may have a little different view as to whether that's actually true or not. We have an opportunity as 2015 approaches for the City of Los Angeles to take at least one of two potential different roles with regard to Santa Monica. One is to be a team player with Santa Monica on this issue and recognize that the City of Santa Monica's residents and LA residents do have one set of common interests, and you've just heard a piece of those interests: lead, fine particulates, and noise. Now, of course, the issue here is that the City of Santa Monica has encouraged flights to be over the City of Los Angeles instead of the City of Santa Monica. And there is some divergence of opinion. But lead, fine particulates, same issues for all of us. We all breathe the same air. So one approach is to try to find the common ground with the City of Santa Monica and have the City of Los Angeles City Attorney join with the City of Santa Monica City Attorney to try to coalesce around this issue, to do what we can to shut down the airport or at least severely curtail the services of the airport. And there are several areas we can do that, as you know, in terms of runway length, for example. There are restrictions that could be imposed, in terms of parking and fueling and other alternatives that would at least reduce the impacts of the airport in the community. The other approach is to be more adversarial. Now, that approach would require the City of Los Angeles to embark on a nuisance-related piece of litigation with regards to Santa Monica. That gets complicated, let's be real about it, because as you know, there's this thing called the municipal proprietor exception to FAA rules.